We've been talking so far about reconstructing arguments, right? So on Tuesday, we talked about learning to recognize arguments and being able to recognize the different component parts of arguments. So you're able to reconstruct that argument into to show its logical form. What you need to be able to do when reconstructing that argument is learning to recognize different forms of different ways in which language can be used. By which I mean that what people are saying to you or writing to you is not necessarily just a bunch of propositions. No, people use rhetoric as well, and they tend to express themselves in a vague or ambiguous way. So we need to be dealing with unclear use of language when we're trying to figure out what reasons people are trying to give us for accepting certain conclusions. Which is what we'll be talking about today in the first part of the lecture, is translating unclear language into clear propositions, which is an important step in the analysis of reasoning. We're also going to talk about the ways in which people can be considered to be irrational. So if you use certain models of behavior, rational behavior, we can see examples or show examples. We can use ourselves as examples of the ways in which people fail to meet those rational standards. So the ways in which people can be considered to be irrational. That is relevant because it's a, prequel of next week, you could say. Next week we're going to talk about ways in which we can use rationality and ways in which we can use probability to look or to assess the structure of an argument. For now, it's important to see that we're not very rational, at least not in an intuitive way. We use a different way of making decisions using shortcuts, which can result in bias. So it's important to look into that, to remind ourselves again that we're not intuitive rational thinkers, that we're not intuitive users of logic and probability in the way in which we assess arguments before we get started assessing those arguments ourselves next week. It's also useful to remind ourselves of the way in which we decide and the ways in which we come to certain behaviors and the fact that that's not rational because it taps into that need for developing that critical disposition we've been talking about so far, right? So the important steps for this week were to develop that critical disposition. We talked about that Tuesday, but the remarks I'm making about a lack of an intuitive rationality and the fact that the usage of some useful forms of heuristics in our decision making can lead to bias should give you another reason for developing that critical disposition. That ability to recognize, in this specific situation, a more critical view of the information that's been given is called for, and I'm able to provide it. Of course, other steps are learning to recognize arguments and learning to reconstruct arguments, which is what we'll be focusing on as well today when we'll be talking about the use of language. All right, let's get started. I promised you the last lecture I would give you an example of ways in which of an example exam question. This is an exam question from the resit that we had this summer.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I think it's an explanation because the point of an argument is to persuade, and not the quote on the screen isn't trying to persuade us of anything, of any action.
Right. I would be tempted to agree with you. I think the point is, and I'm basically saying this, so good answer, thanks. The reason why Trump decided to do such a thing basically indicates, well, here's an explanation coming for why something is the case. So I'm not trying to convince you that something is the case. I'm trying to convince you why something is the case. Mai Ling, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Could you illustrate the answer you've given and why you've given it?
Yeah, I think my answer is wrong, but I gave it because I was looking out for indicator words.
Right.
And I tried to insert indicator words and worked out, and that is why my conclusion is that he decided to tear gas his way to the church, and the conclusion is the premise is that he's the president of law and order, but I think it's wrong. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what I saw in your comment is that you gave Trump as a president of law and order in your first premise, and your conclusion was the reason why Trump decided to tear gas his way, etc. So what I'm trying to indicate is here that you were on a right track, right? So your that wasn't your illustration, but if you would have said to me, or if you would have given your answer as an answer in the exam, and you would have indicated in your comment, because it asked for an explanation of the choices you've made in reconstructing the excerpt, if you would have said, this looks to me like an attempt to reason to the best explanation, which is something we'll get into in more detail in the coming weeks. So there's one form of argument which offers an explanation as a conclusion, in which you're trying to argue that the conclusion is true, which says that such and such is the best explanation for that stuff that happened. That could have been an interpretation of this question if you give the right explanation of the choices you've made, that I would consider, we'll have to give some points as well, because there's not a lot of context for this exam question. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is two things. So first of all, you have to be, the answer model said this is an explanation and an exclamation. So bizarre is an exclamation, and the rest of which is offered is an explanation. So basically, there's nothing to reconstruct here. Would have been the correct answer according to the model used for this reset exam.
Can I ask something?
Yeah. Just 1 second. Let me finish finish my thought. It is, of course, an open question. So if you think, well, I have very good reasons to say that, well, we can consider it to be an explanation and leave everything out, but you could also interpret it as an argument, as a way of arguing that a specific explanation is the best explanation, and you give good reason for it in your open answer, then of course you can score points for that as well. That's the beauty of open questions, right? So that you can give some illustration that go beyond the fixed options in a multiple choice. But for now, if you're confused, you should be able to see that there's an explanation offered here. And that's what we were looking for in this example. All right, go ahead with your question. I didn't see who you were with the question, so go ahead.
Hi. So I was wondering if maybe in this example, there's like an implicit conclusion that his behavior is bizarre, and then that's supported by, he tear gassed his way to the church.
Right. Right. I get what you're saying. That could be an interpretation that leads to an argument, the way in which you're interpreting the same text as being part of an argument. So it's a good suggestion and good that you bring it up. But you have to make a lot of assumptions to make that argument work. More assumptions, and you don't necessarily get a very good argument out of it. So it would be more charitable to say what's intended here is an explanation and go with that. You have to make the least assumptions for that interpretation. So that's why, yeah. So I'm a bit hesitant here because we're going to cover this in more detail in 2 weeks from now. We're going to talk about that balance between charity, so giving the best possible interpretation of what somebody's trying to say, as well as making sure that we don't go overboard in making assumptions about what people are trying to say, right? So we don't, at a certain point, the argument just becomes your arguing instead of the argument you're trying to reconstruct. So that's why we have to be parsimonious in our interpretation of an argument. So it's a good suggestion, and it's important that we talk about it. For now, I would argue the explanation part, interpretation is the most, would be the most reasonable here. And I'm going to give you another example to lay your fears at rest, because what I'm saying to you now basically is that, yeah, here's an exam question. You can interpret it 2 ways or perhaps even 3 ways. And that usually scares students because you just want to know that's the correct answer and that's the correct answer, which is understandable. But again, we deal with an active interpretation of language, right? So that's always an active interpretation. That's always dependent on the context in which you interpret that language. But to lay your worries at rest, here's another example of a part of an exam question. So this was the base of a question, of a multiple choice question, which you're gonna do in the tutorial next week. So I don't want to spoil too much of the surprise. So this is another example. It's clear that the streets are empty since the virus hit. And I can also see a lot of people reaching out to others online from their homes. So the virus COVID-19 has made a lot of people afraid to go outside. This would be because people are scared by the news, but also because they legitimately can be considered to be part of an at-risk group. I'm sorry, I should have switched to the other screen. I'm still getting the hang of this. That would have been too small for you to read along with, right? So there it is. By the way, I've as requested, I've uploaded the slides on Canvas, or the preliminary version of the slides on Canvas. So you can check those out if you want to read along in the actual slides. What for now is important, that it should be very obvious to you that the part printed in red is an indicator of an explanation is coming, right? So if you were to reconstruct this argument, you should use the first couple of lines, the first 3 lines, but the rest that follows is an explanation for why something is the case. Indeed, there are 2 reasons offered here why something can consider to be true. The fact that the virus had made a lot of people afraid to go outside. So you can reconstruct that argument using 2 premises and a conclusion, but the rest that follows should be recognized as an explanation. So if somebody's saying to you, this would be the case because, then even in this context, it should be clear that an explanation is being offered. All right, so summing up, I've given you an example of an exam question. Usually I'm not that nasty that I'm just giving you an excerpt which only contains an explanation. Usually the examples I use look more like this. So there, part of it, the reconstruction, might be considered an explanation. And make sure you're on the lookout. So what part of this spoken text is actually can be considered an argument and can be considered actual propositions relevant in arguing that something is the case. If you're still a bit confused about the difference what it takes to reconstruct an argument, we will return to the point when we're discussing chapter 5 and parts of chapter 6, which will be 2 weeks from now. All right. Moving on to another example. So this tutorial, of the tutorials this week, you've been doing an intuitive analysis, intuitive assessment of arguments, and we're going to apply that same way of thinking to another example from the media. So perhaps you're familiar with this example of another American president, Bill Clinton in this case, who was the American president in the 90s. And he, his presidency is partly remembered for the fact that he was almost impeached because of lying about an affair he had with one of his staffers, Monica Lewinsky. And this is the lie. There's nothing going on between us, is basically one of the things he said about, I did not have sexual relationships with that woman. It was something else that he said. And there was a deposition in a legal case about it. And during that deposition, he said something interesting. He was trying to argue why what he said, there's nothing going on between us, or what his lawyer stated in his name, that there was nothing going on between them, or there is nothing going on between them. The difference is important. Why he wasn't actually lying at the time. So we're not talking about whether he had sexual relationship with that woman. It turned out that he had. We're now talking about whether he lied about it by saying there's nothing going on between us. And he argued, and you have to hear it from his own mouth because it's so mind-boggling that he said it, or that he made that argument. Let's see. I'll have to pull that up. Yes, and then
With Ms. Lewinsky, the statement that there was no sex.
1 second. I mean, this is something I still have to figure out. So I'm trying to share. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I hope this works, that you can hear sound and see the video smoothly. But it's been a hassle trying to figure out the best way of sharing video material with you. But here we go. We're going to try it. But getting there and getting back to the video is a hassle. Okay, so there we go.
Of any kind, in any manner, shape, or form with President Clinton was an utterly false statement. Is that correct?
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is. Yes. If is means is and never has been, that's one thing. If it means there is none, that was a completely true statement. But as I have testified, I'd like to testify again. It is somewhat unusual for a client to be asked about his lawyer's statements instead of the other way around.
All right, so that should strike you as an interesting way to present an argument, right? You could hear it fine, and you could see the video fine, I'm hoping, right? All right. So what he was saying basically was the following. Let me see. Yeah, there it is again. Okay, that went kind of smoothly. This is what he was saying. I'll make it somewhat bigger for you to read. It depends on what. So the question is he lying when he's saying there's nothing going on between us, or when he said there is nothing going on between us? It depends on what the meaning of the word is. If is means and never has been, that is one thing. If it means there is none, that was a completely true statement. So what he is saying, basically, if we reconstruct this as an argument, and you can do this intuitively, you should kind of get a sense of what he's trying to argue. What he's trying to say is that I wasn't lying, right? That should be clear. That's the conclusion he's working towards in that context. I was making a factual statement. Statement X is true. So if you would put that in the standard form, I'm not going to ask you to be doing this in an actual exam, by the way. This is just training your intuitive sense of reconstructing an argument. What he's trying to argue is that statement X is true because if is used in the present tense, it only signifies events currently taking place. President Clinton's lawyer gave a statement X containing an is used in the present tense, right? Then left implicit in this fragment, at least, is the following. Statement X denied there being any sexual relationships between Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton. President Clinton, and this is the crucial part, so we have almost all ingredients. He says that if you use is in the present tense, it only signifies stuff going on at this very moment. He used the word is in the present tense when he said there is nothing going on between us. And when he said there's nothing going on between us, on that very moment, he wasn't actually having sex with Monica Lewinsky. So in that sense, the statement is true. When I say there's nothing going on between us, you see me sitting here, talking to you, making this statement. I'm not having sex with her, so the statement is true. It's bizarre. It's a good argument, right? But it's bizarre that it's such a weird way of using language that nobody would have thought that he meant using that term in that way when he made that claim. Which just shows you all the ambiguities and all the vaguenesses that are inherent in using language and the extent to which you can go in a legal case to worm your way out of, well, in this case, clearly having lied in almost all possible interpretations except this one, which is still allowed for by the actual language used.